Just before we get into this video, guys, if you want to follow me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, the links are here. And if you also want to support me on Patreon as well and help out my channel, that would be absolutely awesome as well. But let's get on with the video. Hey guys, it is Wingy here and welcome to a brand new video. Now today's video is also suggested by one of my patrons. So Dr. Hooster, this is the video that you suggested, so thank you to you for the suggestion and also supporting me on Patreon, and I would assume subscribing to me on here, but I don't want to get presumptuous. As you can tell from the title and thumbnail, this is talking about my favourite stories with UNIT. Obviously them being the big alien investigation company or organisation that exists within the world of Doctor Who. They've appeared in pretty much all the spin-offs, I think, as well as being a major part of Doctor Who, particularly in the late 60s and early 1970s. So putting together my favourite three was quite hard, because I love a lot of the Pertwee stories, which they are most prominent in, and I also love quite a few stories, obviously, that don't feature Pertwee, but that have UNIT in them, because they're such a prominent force in Doctor Who, it's hard to choose. Some of the most iconic characters in Doctor Who history are members of UNIT, such as the Brigadier, of course, as well as Sergeant Benton, Liz Shaw, Joe Grant. With this though, I've tried to be a bit diplomatic. I could just go for three Pertwee stories, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go for a Troughton story, a Pertwee story, which was really hard, and a Tom Baker story. So that's what we're going to talk about. So we'll go in chronological order. So we'll talk about, first and foremost, The Invasion with Patrick Troughton. I mean, it doesn't need a genius to work out that I love the Cybermen and they're my favourite Doctor Who villain. I go on about them all the time. I've spoken about The Invasion a few times before as well, and this story is essentially the template for the entire Pertwee era, but with Cybermen, something that we would weirdly never actually get within the Jon Pertwee era. I wonder why. They seem like the perfect villain to have in the Pertwee era, like Earth Invasion stuff, but there you go. The Invasion is an almost perfect story in my mind, and the fact that it's 8 parts long yet can still hold people's attention is credit to it, because a lot of stories, particularly in that early Pertwee era, really do drag on, and they're only like 6 or 7 parts, so they're not even as long as this. Obviously Patrick Troughton wouldn't go on to have this as the norm within his era. In fact, he was only a few stories away from regenerating, and this would be the format for the Pertwee era. So it is also kind of nice to see a different Doctor in a third Doctor story, if that makes sense. I mean, if this didn't work, what would they have done? I don't know. But I like seeing that dynamic. You've even got characters like Benton in this, which I think is his first story. You've got Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. I think this is the first story that he is a Brigadier, in fact. You've got a few other members of UNIT that would later go on to appear in the Pertwee era, and you just have that new dynamic, and it feels fresh. It feels great to have an ensemble cast in Doctor Who, because it's not something that really, besides the Doctor and companions, has ever been a thing before. Some people would argue that doing that changes fundamentally what Doctor Who is about, but if you've seen the Pertwee era, it totally works. They went balls out with certain moments in this as well. Stuff with the helicopter, some of the fight sequences with the Cybermen, like there's a shootout towards the end of the story. That's really cool, and it just emphasises how awesome some of these characters are. It also emphasises how fucking useless some of these characters are. Mostly the extras, because UNIT soldiers tend to just fall over and over-dramatically die constantly whenever they're in a story, and that is definitely no exception within this story, but it's still great, it's still fantastic. It was nice to see the groundwork laid in a story like this, and especially because it's a Cyberman story. Maybe that's why I love it as much as I do, but who's to say. Next then, I will go to the Pertwee era, which was the hardest one of the entire list, because the Pertwee era is brilliant. It's really, really good, and UNIT is in, I would say, about 80% of it, so it's hard to just narrow that down to one story. But when I thought about it, I realised that my favourite Jon Pertwee stories don't actually have UNIT in them. Stories like Frontier in Space and The Sea Devils. The Time Warrior does feature like the Brigadier briefly, but it's not really a prominent UNIT story, you would say. Spearhead from Space, for me, is the best post-regeneration story, on a par with The 11th Hour. This totally introduced you to the new dynamic. I know I said that the invasion sort of preempted that, but with this, nope, you've got the full thing now. I mean, it only works for one story, because if you do it again later on when Tom comes in, it doesn't work and it gets boring and it gets repetitive. But the whole idea of the Brigadier and everyone else not really believing that this is the Doctor and it's just some lunatic who is pretending to be him, that was quite a nice dynamic throughout the entire thing. And again, because you have got that new Doctor, it's great to see that established relationship change, because we have seen this character interact with the Doctor before, yet this time it's different because the Doctor's changed his face. Again, it is just a showcase for what is to come in its era, and I suppose that is exactly what you want from a Doctor's first story. For example, with Tom's first story, that's just a Pertwee story. Nothing like a Tom Baker story whatsoever, whereas this one, it's 100% a John Pertwee style story. What I like about going back to Spearhead as well is when you look at that to where Unit ends up, like the bigger lab or more ensemble characters like Captain Yates, characters like that, it's really cool to see how they start in quite a humble way, almost. You see them grow throughout the Pertwee era, so it is nice to revisit this one and just look to see where they end up. Even the uniforms change. I don't quite like the original uniform though, I must admit. I quite like the colour, but the outfit just looks a bit weird to me. But not only that, Spearhead from Space is also a phenomenal story. It really, really, truly is. I mean, it introduces the characters of, or the villains of, the Nestine Consciousness and the Autons, two of the most iconic Doctor Who monsters that would appear in Doctor Who, so much so that when it came back in 2005, who was the enemy in the very first episode? Nicholas Courtney and John Pertwee have a wonderful rapport, and to see it start to develop in this story is a beautiful thing to watch, because like I say, where Unit ends up and where it goes and their dynamic and whatnot. And then finally, I said I was going to go with a Tom story because this was a story that I couldn't really ignore, and I suppose it's also quite a bittersweet one as well, and that is Terror of the Zygons. Terror of the Zygons is an all-time classic Doctor Who story. Again, it does kind of feel like a Pertwee story, however, because Tom is more established as the Doctor at this point, it definitely feels more like a Tom story, even though the actual premise of it is very John Pertwee-esque. And I say it was bittersweet because this would be the last time that the Brigadier would appear as a regular. That kind of rhymed then. It would be the last time that the Brigadier appeared as a regular in Doctor Who, and he wouldn't appear again until early 1980s. I think it was like 1983, something like that. Other characters would appear later on in the very season that this one is in, but it wouldn't really feel the same without the Brigadier. This kind of feels like the last time the gang was all together. I mean, there's Yates as well, but I don't really fucking like Yates. Again, seeing the dynamic between the Brigadier and a different Doctor is incredibly interesting. In fact, seeing any character interact with multiple incarnations of the Doctor is always going to be interesting, but I quite like the fact that for a long time, the Brigadier and the third Doctor, they grew this rapport, they got really close with each other. Obviously they would bicker, sort of like an old married couple, but they would get on with each other. And then all of a sudden, the Doctor changes, and he's this off-the-wall buffoon, and the Brigadier's just kind of like, I don't know how to deal with this guy now. I'm just going to leave him to his devices. Sure, whatever. One thing as well that I love about Terror of the Zygons is it gives us a moment, which I think if you'd been a regular watcher, or if you've seen all of the Pertwee era and then were, you know, doing a marathon, get up to this point, it gives you a really satisfying moment for the Brigadier. Finally, the Brigadier shoot and kill a villain. I mean, I'm sure it's happened a couple of times, but it is very infrequent that bullets would actually be effective against whatever it is that Unit and the Doctor are fighting. Even in the last story that he appeared in, the Brigadier said, "Just once, I wish there was one alien menace that wasn't immune to bullets." Then all of a sudden at the very end of Terror of the Zygons, the Brigadier just comes in and goes bang. I don't think the character of the Brigadier would actually come out and say this because of who he is as a character, but in his mind, in that moment, you just look at him and he's just thinking like, fucking yes. It is such a shame that they did write Unit out of Doctor Who at this point. It was understandable, it needed to happen. With Tom's Doctor, you can't imagine him staying on Earth. It just wouldn't work for his character, so they had to branch away. It would have been nice if maybe once a year they went back to Unit, but then again, if you want the show to evolve, you want the show to progress, sometimes you have to leave that kind of stuff behind, and ultimately they did. But as a last regular appearance for the Brigadier, absolutely brilliant. And I also think that the android invasion, the next Unit story after this one, and also I think the last Unit story until Battlefield, which is mad, is also a really good story. I really like the android invasion, but it's not really a Unit story per se because the Brigadier's not in it. I know Benton's in it, but Actually, here's a point. At the end of the android invasion, you don't actually know what happens to Benton. He sort of gets knocked unconscious, but you don't see him again after that. Weird. Maybe he's dead. Who knows? I hope not. I like Benton. But I mean, there's a plethora of stories that I could have said in this video. I mean, stories like the android invasion, like I've just spoken about then. The Ambassadors of Death. That's a really good one. The Web of Fear, which I know they're not technically unit then, but it's essentially a unit story, isn't it? Claws of Axos I really like. Three Doctors I think is brilliant. Terror of the Autons is another great story. Planet of the Spiders I enjoy. Robot I even enjoy as well. Like, pretty much any unit story is good. Did I say Claws of Axos? Because I really like Claws of Axos. I think I did. I'll know in the edit, so if this bit doesn't make it in, then it means I've edited it out, or I've left it in just to show you what a forgetful fuck I actually am. But again, thank you to Dr. Hooster for suggesting this video on Patreon. Very much appreciated, and if you want to suggest a video idea to me, then support me on Patreon and get in touch. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like on it, subscribe for more. Social media and the Patreon link will be in the description below, as always. And if you would do any of those things, I would absolutely love you forever. But till next time, guys, you take care of yourselves. Goodbye.